Welcome back to the latest episode of TT Plays, and today we're going to be talking about a new Dusk Till Dawn card, Warmonger's Diplomacy. Franklin back there just 8, he's ready to go. We do have some Leviathan content coming up in the future, talking about the recursion technique, especially Blazafet. We also have some Icelander videos coming up. Obviously, Icelander won a Battle Hardened, which is really cool, and then Rhea, I believe is how you pronounce their name, was playing a really cool deck, more of an actual wizard deck, and less of the traditional Bulllander deck. But today we're going to be talking about Warmonger's Diplomacy, and we're going to wrap it up talking about how Warmonger's interacts with Icelander's special ability. So what is Warmonger's Diplomacy? Well, it's a new way for you to spend $25 to $35, and it's a Majestic that is a blue 3-block. So I want to highlight that. It's a blue 3-block. It's phenomenal if all it does is pitch for blue or block for 3. It's just, you get good value there. And then it basically has Commander Magic the Gathering text stack on top, right? Which is, starting with the hero to your left, each hero chooses War Peace. If they choose War, the only actions they may play or activate on their next turn are weapon and attack actions. If they choose Peace, the only actions they may play or activate during their next turn are non-weapon, non-attack actions. So again, it's plays or activates. And that's where it catches people. A lot of aggro decks play or activate a variety of go-again effects and don't even think about it. So ninjas, this card really doesn't impact ninjas. Ninjas are still just all gas, let's move forward, I'm just going to attack you a million times. But the traditional Runeblade decks are really impacted by this. If you think about Viserai or Briar, right, some of those traditional decks, right, I've got a heap of non-attack attack reactions, right, about half of them. I've got a heap of attacks. We try to keep this 50-50 mix. I want a Mauve Sky to get Go Again. I want a Shrill. Shrill gets the buff. I've got a Float left over. Maybe I toss a Swarming in there. All right, Viserai can't do that. Viserai's got to pick one or the other. Now note it says play or activate, right? So this Grasp the Arcanite once per turn. If I choose War, I can't activate Grasp. It's not a weapon. It's not an attack card. And now things kind of come together. Oh, this is going to kind of be a pain in the butt. If I choose War, I can't activate Aetherweave. It's not a weapon. It's not an attack card. Okay. It's getting a little annoying now, right? So we can see it's obviously very powerful into Runeblades. Briar, very similar, right? Briar wants to play non-attacks and attacks. So for Briar, it shuts it down equally as well. Lexi, right? The deck that I still think is on top of the meta, despite losing Bracers, and now with Warmonger, so maybe we'll reevaluate, but Lexi really utilizes this double arsenal zone. And they only have the double arsenal zone if they have a face-up card in their arsenal. How do they get cards face-up? Well, they use Lexi. Once per turn action. All right, it's an action. It's not an attack action. It is not a weapon action. So if Lexi chooses War, she can't Lexi flip. If she can't Lexi flip and only has one face-down card in arsenal, the only card they can play is that card in arsenal. And if that isn't something they can play, whether you know about it from a fuse or something like that, or whether you just log jam them, you can actually freeze out Lexi for a turn. So already as we talk about it, you can see the Warmongers can be a really powerful pivot card. I block with 3 cards in my hand. I come back to my turn. I use Diplomacy to pivot. My opponent is going to have a very weak turn if they're playing Runeblade, Ranger, any of these other things that want to use these multiple attack action formats here. And then it's going to pivot back to me. Since they've had a weaker turn, I didn't take a lot of damage, right? And I'm able to regain tempo and leverage that moving forward. Azalea is another one, right? We can't use Skullbone Crosswrap. We can't use Azalea, right? Obviously, things Azalea likes to do. Azalea also wants to play like buff, arrow. Well, we can't do that either. You can shoot me once with an arrow. So we can kind of see the power and the appeal of Warmonger's Diplomacy and why it's kind of spiked up to that $25 card. Dromai is interesting. A lot of people have asked me, can you attack with allies? And the answer is yes. There's an official posting on the Judge Discord. You can look at it there. I don't want to explain it because honestly, ally rules are confusing, but long story short is if you choose War, you can attack with your ally dragons. Now, Dromai is going to have a hard time giving them Go Again. If it's the red line version, they might not have a hard time at all, but if it's not the red line version, they're going to have to Oasis or Sigil or maybe even Sand Cover on their own turn in order to play that red card to grant their dragons Go Again. So would I bring this in against Dromai? Maybe. But am I going to bring it in against like the traditional Runeblades and Rangers? Absolutely. It also catches some weird other classes you wouldn't expect, right? Bravo can't activate Tectonic Plating or the Bravo hero ability. Right? So like Anothos for 4 is way less appealing than Make a Seismic Surge and Anothos for 6. So there's just a whole bunch of classes it incidentally clips, right? Even Icelander, who normally presents mixed damage, has to make a decision here. Now, Icelander, I think, can pivot probably better than a lot of those other decks we listed. But there are some obvious hiccups and issues using it. So, Warmonger's Diplomacy, a blue block 3 that is incredibly impactful and a great pivot card being used into a lot of the popular decks towards the top of the meta. Now, is Warmonger's Diplomacy worth this? I don't know. It's your money. I make it a goal to stay out of other people's wallets, but it's actually selling for this much. Rainbow foils are going for a bit more here. Would I pay this much for the card? Maybe. You know, Majestic prices in general have confused me in the last couple sets. Surgical Extraction kind of made sense because Surgical Extraction was short printed, so it went for $50, $60 at one point in time. It's also a staple to a Uziri deck, right? All right. Really good card. I get it. That makes a ton of sense. Premeditate and Codex. Really good cards. Narrow banded, but really good cards, right? Surgical also extremely narrowly banded, as in like the breadth of decks that play it. And both of those are holding at about $20 to $30 respectively. So now when we talk about Warmonger's Diplomacy being a generic action that's strong into the top of the meta, do I think its price is going to go down? I don't know. I wouldn't be shocked if the price of this stays really high because it is a card that is very powerful. People are going to want 3, and it's not just Rangers or Assassins that are going to want 3 of these, right? Everyone who is worried about this, who wants this in their sideboard card, who likes a blue block 3 that also can be used for a great pivot turn, is going to want a Warmonger's Diplomacy. So I wouldn't be shocked if the price in this stays high. Now, the other side, and I'm going to argue both sides of this argument here, is like Dynasty was opened a lot for sealed events. There's obviously not going to be any sealed events till Dusk Till Dawn. That being said, Dusk Till Dawn has arguably the biggest chase cards we've seen yet with the signed art things. So at least the first edition printing of Dusk Till Dawn, I believe, will be fully opened. So there'll be a lot of product opened out there. But at the same time, if you think of almost every competitive player is going to want a playset of this, like if that's your belief that Warmongers are strong enough, and I happen to believe it is, that every competitive player is going to want a sideboard set of these, then yeah, I could see the price honestly staying, relatively speaking, high. Now, the flip side of that is, are they going to ban Warmongers? And I have absolutely no idea, but I wouldn't be shocked if they did because it's not terribly interactive. Normally in Flesh and Blood, you have these interaction points where you basically have a decision to make. And yeah, before you get there, I understand. You make a decision, right? War or peace. But the ramifications of that decision are really, really restrictive, right? This is kind of like Hypothermia. And I think there's a reason that like Blizzard and Channel Lake Frigid were unbanned and Hypothermia was banned, right? Hypothermia says you just can't do things. And that's what Warmonger says. Channel Lake and Blizzard say you can do things, it'll cost you more. You'll have to think about it, you'll have to plan your way around it. So my biggest fear about Warmongers would be its long-term viability. Like, do they want this really powerful generic out there? I was lucky enough, I picked up a bunch over release weekend. I've got some listed on TCG Player right now. I'm keeping a couple sets for Team Advantage just so we have a few sets amongst the team to utilize ourselves. I do want to talk about some other things. This only impacts actions. Attack reactions are not actions. Instants are not actions. Feel free to play them. That's why we're saying Dromai can use those instants in order to get around things. Dory, Bolton, again, a bunch of different options they can do to get around this because if they're just mainly playing attack reaction based, again, you're fine. This only impacts actions. But again, it's a very impactful, really strong pivot card, right? Block with 3, pivot into one of those decks. I know that deck is going to have a weaker turn next turn. Come back to my turn, regain tempo. Now, Warmonger's Diplomacy with Icelander. I see a lot of people misplay Warmonger's Diplomacy in general, and I see even more misplay it when playing Icelander. So they want to play this as instant speed on my opponent's turn, and they always say, what happens to the attack card they already played? Well, the card they already played doesn't matter. It's in the past. And it's important to point out here that if they choose War, the only actions they may play or activate during their next turn. So if Viserai activates, casts Mordred Tide, and I respond with Warmonger's Diplomacy, Viserai isn't picking what they play after the Mordred Tide. Viserai is choosing what they're going to play next turn. And most of the time, Viserai is not going to care, because if they're playing a Mordred Tide this time, you're going to get Mordred, Mauve, Shrilled, Reveled, right? So, Diplomacy, phenomenal card, not fantastic as an Icelander instant. Now, it's still a good card. I wouldn't be upset about keeping this down to my arsenal, but it's not this, let me shut your turn down in the middle of your turn. This, again, is going to impact the next turn for the opponent. So the Icelander player is going to be impacted by Warmongers first. Then the opponent whose turn you played on is going to be impacted. So it's kind of a weird, longer pivot there. But again, it doesn't impact your opponent the turn you flash it out, because it says specifically next turn. So all in all, Franklin and I really like Warmonger's Diplomacy. We're happy we picked some up. Let me know down in the comments if you were able to pick your copy up. Let me know what you think Warmongers is going to settle into. Again, the Majestics lately have been confusing, right? With Surgical being at that really high value despite being incredibly narrow banded, right? Codex and Premeditate both holding their value, relatively speaking, well. Again, I wouldn't be shocked if Warmongers had held its value as well, too. So until next time, everyone, cheers and happy gaming.